On the kind of night when most creatures run from the hills, one wild bobcat walked straight into the glow. It was late summer in the Arizona high country. The wind had been wrong all afternoon, and by dark the fire had jumped 2 ridges and was chewing its way toward a scattering of old cabins under the pines. Engines groaned up the narrow road, tires grinding over gravel, red and white lights flickering across tree trunks that were already dusted with ash. Inside the cab of one of those trucks sat a man named Calvin. He'd been a firefighter long enough that smoke felt like an old language in his lungs. The radio at his shoulder crackled with phrases he knew by heart. Structure protection only. No time for full sweeps. Move on if it's already gone. The map on his lap was mostly red. Out the windshield, he watched the world narrow down to what the headlights could reach. A fence post, a mailbox, a flash of metal roof. Sometimes a shape would flicker at the edge of the beams. A deer, a coyote. Once the pale flare of an owl's wings, and then vanish back into the dark, doing what wild things are supposed to do when fire comes. They run. Until they didn't. As the engine rounded one tight curve, the crew caught sight of a small cabin set back from the road. Flames licked at its eaves. One side of the roof was already sagging. Someone in the back muttered, "That one's gone." The driver started to ease past. That's when Calvin saw her. A bobcat stood on the porch, directly in front of the door. Smoke smeared her coat darker in patches, but even through the glass of the windshield, he could see the short, powerful body, the tufted ears, the stillness. Not the frozen panic of a cornered animal, but a kind of deliberate, planted stillness. The rest of the world was moving, branches shaking in the heat, embers lifting on the wind, but she was not. Most wild bobcats, he knew, are ghosts. You might see paw prints in dusty sand, or catch a blur of spots at dawn, and that's it. Engines, sirens, voices? They're gone before you're close enough to know what you saw. That's normal. That's healthy. This one didn't move. The headlights washed over the cabin. In that brief sweep, as the truck rolled closer, Calvin caught something else. Through a dirty side window, just beyond the bobcat's shoulder, there was a narrow wooden bed against the wall of a back room. The glass was streaked with soot. The room behind it was heavy with smoke, but the shape was unmistakable. The simple outline of a crib-sized frame, low and rectangular. For a second, his mind filed it away as a detail, just furniture. Just one more thing about to be lost, in a region that has known too many losses already. Then the truck pulled almost even with the porch, and the bobcat did something he would replay in his head for years. She took a step forward, toward the edge of the boards, into the full glare of the lights. Her body was angled slightly across the door, not locking it completely, but not giving it up either. She didn't bare her teeth. She didn't crouch as if to spring. She just stood there, eyes narrowed against the brightness, ears flicking once, and held her ground. Calvin's hand tightened on the dash. "Slow it down," he heard himself say before he'd fully decided why. The driver glanced over, surprised. "Command said move on. That roof's already—" "I know." Calvin's voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "Just hold up a second." The engine idled, rumbling under them. Somewhere beyond the trees, another column of flame punched into the sky. Every second they sat here was a second not spent on a home that could still be saved. He felt that calculation like a weight on his chest. You don't last long in this work if you don't learn to make those trades. But there was also the bobcat, framed in the wash of the headlights, refusing to bolt. There was the faint outline of that small wooden bed in the back room. There was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time, rising past the radio chatter and the training and the years. Something is wrong here, and if you drive away, you will never forgive yourself. If you've ever sat in your car outside an emergency room or watched smoke on the horizon and felt torn between what you're supposed to do and what your gut is whispering, you know a little of what lived in that pause. Calvin thought of all the calls where they'd arrived too late, all the doors they'd opened onto rooms already quiet. The memory brushed the back of his neck like cold air. He could almost hear the future version of himself, decades from now, sitting on some porch saying, "There was this one night. We drove past a cabin, and there was a bobcat on the porch, and I didn't stop." The truck's headlights hummed. The bobcat, this wild, smoke-streaked animal from the ridges above town, stood her ground like a living question. Finally, he exhaled. "I'm going in," he told the crew, already reaching for the door handle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He just chose. Later, when people in town told the story, they'd talk about the miracle of what was found on that narrow bed in the back room. They'd talk about how this bobcat refused to leave the burning cabin, and how that stubborn stand on the porch changed a stranger's life. But in this first moment, it was simpler than that. It was a tired man in a smoke-filled night, listening to something he couldn't quite name. If this opening already stirs something in you, maybe a memory of a night you wish had gone differently, or of an animal that stayed close when you needed it most, stay with this story. In the next part, we'll step away from the flames for a moment and walk the ridges where this bobcat lived long before the fire, to understand what kind of grief might keep a wild heart from running when the world tells it to flee. Long before she stood on that burning porch, the bobcat already knew what fire could take. Up on the ridges above town, where the pines thin out and the ground turns rocky and sparse, Solace had carved out a quiet life. Most folks down in the valley never saw her. At best, they caught a glimpse now and then, a shadow slipping between junipers at dawn, tracks pressed into the dusty shoulder of a dirt road, a blur of spotted fur vanishing at the edge of a field. She belonged to that in-between world, close enough to our fences to drink from a stock tank, wild enough to disappear before a truck ever rounded the bend. 1 year before the night of the big fire, there was another blaze, smaller on the maps, but close enough to matter in the places that counted. Lightning had walked across the ridge, touching down in dry grass. Crews caught most of it quickly, but a tongue of flame ran ahead of them down into a rocky draw where Solace had made her den. In that den, tucked into the cool side of a boulder, was her litter. We don't have footage of what happened there. No camera sat in the doorway of that sheltered hollow. What we have instead are signs, read later like handwriting by people who know how to look. Scorched bark around the draw, soot deep in the soil, tracks that looped and crossed on the slope above. A biologist walked to that site with a map and a notebook and said quietly, "Something lived here, and something ended here." For weeks after that fire, ranchers on the north side of town started noticing the same stray detail. At odd hours, just before dawn or under a thin moon, they'd see a bobcat moving along the edge of the old burn scar. Not hunting, not traveling through, just returning. She would come to the same charred spill of rocks, stand still for a long moment, then move on. A few days later, she'd be seen circling that draw again. Wildlife folks have a word for this kind of thing: revisiting. Some animals, after losing a den, come back to the site over and over. They sniff the air, test the ground, and stand where they once curled around their young. We don't know exactly what's happening inside them. We can't ask, but we can see the pattern. And if you've ever walked into an empty room in a house you had to leave too quickly, you recognize something in it. Solace began to change in other ways too. Before that season, she'd used the lower washes freely, hunting near the edges of back fences and irrigation ditches. Afterward, whenever a certain kind of smoke drifted down, not the thin gray of a cook fire, but the thick, dry bite of burning timber, she froze. A ranch hand noticed her one evening, standing statue still on a rise, every muscle tight, nose lifted into the air that carried the faintest trace of a prescribed burn miles away. One crackle from a fallen branch sent her bolting uphill.
A rehab worker who studied her later put it in plain terms.
You see this sometimes after a bad season. Predators change their routes. They avoid certain scents. Stress rewires their map. It's not a fairy tale. It's the nervous system doing what it can to keep a body alive. This is where some people pull back.
It's one thing to say a bobcat remembers danger.
It's another to consider that she might carry a kind of grief. But if you've ever had a dog who waited at a door that would never open again, or watched a horse stand too long at an empty stall, you already know animals can hold on to more than just habit. The science talks about behavior and stress responses. Our hearts read something else in those same motions. Solace's territory, after that year, wrapped the fire lines like a scar. She patrolled higher, sticking to the rocky shoulders where the pines gave way to scrub. The old den stayed black and silent. She still hunted, still drank from seeps and tanks, still lay in patches of winter sun like any other bobcat. Life goes on, but every time a column of smoke rose in the distance, something in her stance changed. Her body knew what the maps didn't show. That flame had once crawled into her hidden world and left it empty. That's the Solace who walked down from the ridge on the night we met her at the cabin. Not a blank slate, not a simple symbol, but an animal whose own story already held loss. When she planted herself on that porch, between the door and the open dark, she was carrying more with her than instinct alone. We may never know what she meant by it, and maybe that's okay. Sometimes what matters is not the explanation, but the way a gesture lands in us. For some of you watching, this part of the story might tug at memories you don't talk about often. The storage unit you visited twice after cleaning out a parent's home. The hospital parking lot you drove through long after you needed to. The places your feet kept going even when the world had moved on. If a wild bobcat can circle the site of her own loss, maybe there's nothing strange about the routes your heart still takes. In a few minutes, we're going to leave the ridges and step into a different kind of night. The one Isabel spent at a roadblock, watching smoke rise over the trees and realizing she could not reach the person she loved most. Her story and Solace's are moving toward each other, even though neither of them knows it yet. If you can, stay with this journey. Let it unfold slowly. Somewhere between the burned den on the hillside and the headlights on that narrow Arizona road, there is a line that connects wild grief and human grief in a way charts and numbers never quite capture. Some nights, the hardest distance in the world is the 70 yards you're not allowed to drive. By late afternoon, smoke had already laid a gray film over the valley. Isabel had seen it from the motel parking lot where she worked. A smear against the blue that made everyone talk a little faster, move a little quicker to their cars. The news said the wildfire was still up high, still in the timber. People who'd lived there long enough knew how fast that could change. She clocked out early, tossed her housekeeping card back in the storage closet, and called home. No answer. That wasn't unusual. Her son Daniel could sleep through a thunderstorm and a ringing phone. His old wooden bed had a way of holding on to him, especially after a night shift at the warehouse. She told herself he was fine as she got in the car, just tired, just napping. The road home wound up toward the pines, that familiar two-lane ribbon she could almost drive with her eyes closed. Except this time, halfway there, she saw something she'd never seen on that stretch. Flashing lights, barricades, and a line of vehicles stopped in both directions. She pulled up behind a horse trailer, rolled down the window, and felt the heat like a hand on her face. Ash floated in slow spirals through the headlight. At the front of the line, a sheriff's deputy walked from car to car, his reflective vest catching the glow of the flames that were now clearly visible on the ridge above. When he reached her window, Isabel didn't wait for his speech. "My son is up there," she said. "He's home. Cabin on Mill Creek Road, the little one with the blue mailbox. I just called. He didn't answer. He's probably still asleep. I need to get through." The deputy shook his head, tired and gentle. "Ma'am, the fire crossed the line 15 minutes ago. We're not letting anyone back up. Crews are going house to house where they can. You need to go down to the high school. They're setting up a shelter." She tried again. "He's alone. He'll sleep through this. Just let me drive to the driveway. I'll be quick, please." There is a particular kind of panic that shows up in these moments. It doesn't look like screaming. It looks like hands gripping the steering wheel until the knuckles turn pale. It sounds like a voice that keeps coming back to the same sentence, as if repetition might somehow move fire. "Ma'am, I'm sorry." The deputy's face tightened. "If we send you in and that road closes, We've got 3 more people to worry about instead of 1. I know that's not what you want to hear, but that's the truth.
Behind her, someone honked softly, not out of anger, just nerves. The line wanted to move. The world around her was making choices she couldn't accept. She parked off to the side eventually, because there was nowhere else to go. A church bus picked up evacuees from the makeshift roadblock and took them down to the high school gym. Isabel climbed the steps with the others, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. The sky outside the bus windows flickered orange and black. Somewhere up there, beyond the last bend, her cabin and that old crib-sized bed was swallowed in the same light. The gym smelled like floor polish and fear. Volunteers moved quickly, unrolling cots, setting out coolers of water, and lining up tables of donated sandwiches. Someone pressed a blanket into Isabel's arms. Someone else pointed her toward the registration desk. She filled out the form with stiff fingers. Name, address, number of people in her household. 1, she said, then shook her head. 2, my son. He's still up there. They wrote it down and nodded in the practiced way of people who had to nod at many things they couldn't fix. Hours stretched. The TV in the corner showed aerial footage of the wildfire, the camera gliding over walls of flame, bobcat habitat, cabins like toothpicks in its path. Every time the ticker at the bottom mentioned her road, her stomach clenched. Her phone stayed silent. The signal up there had always been spotty, and now it was likely gone. Someone pushed a cup of coffee into her hands, styrofoam, thin and hot. She wrapped both palms around it and barely drank. The cup gave her something to hold that wasn't panic. If you've ever waited in a room like that, you know how sound changes. Every laugh feels too loud. Every ring of a cell phone turns heads. You watch strangers pace, cry, pray, and argue softly with officers over facts no one has yet. You breathe other people's fear along with your own. Near midnight, a group of firefighters came in, faces streaked, eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. They lined up for food, bowed their heads without being asked when someone offered a blessing. One of them, a man with gray at his temples and soot ground into the creases of his hands, sat down a few chairs away from Isabel. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. There was nowhere else to listen. "Got one we shouldn't have gotten," he was saying to the volunteer beside him. His voice had that flat quality of someone too tired to dress anything up. "Cabin on the east side, roof half gone. We almost drove past." But there was this bobcat on the porch, just standing there. Wouldn't budge. Weirdest thing I've seen in 25 years. The volunteer let out a low whistle. "And there was someone inside?" "Yeah, grown man. Lying on this narrow little wooden bed like a kid's frame. Smoke all around him." "If we'd been 5 minutes later." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Isabel sat very still. The cup in her hands trembled. A cabin on the east side. A narrow wooden bed. A bobcat on the porch. The pieces fell together in her mind like the click of a door latch. She didn't stand up and shout. She didn't collapse. She just began to breathe in a new way. Ragged at first, then deep enough to hurt, as one reality slid into another. Her son was out. Her son was alive. And the line she had not been allowed to cross had been crossed by someone else, led there, in part, by a wild animal that had no reason to stay. Later, she would wrestle with the guilt of those hours, of not being the one to open that door, of sitting in a gym while strangers carried her child from a burning room. For now, she just closed her eyes and let the relief and the weight of it all wash through her. If you're watching this and thinking of a night when you also stood on the wrong side of tape or glass or distance, you're not alone. There are so many of us who have had to trust other hands when our own couldn't reach. In the next part, we'll walk back through that cabin door with Calvin to see what he found in the smoke and how his choice on that road changed more lives than he knew. If you can, stay with this story a little longer. Sometimes understanding how all these threads come together makes it easier to be gentle with our own unfinished nights. Sometimes a whole lifetime hangs on the second you decide whether to get out of the truck. Calvin felt the engine shudder beneath him as it idled in front of the cabin. The wildfire was moving fast, chewing through the hillside above, throwing embers across the road like sparks from a grinder. The radio at his shoulder kept insisting there were other houses ahead, other structures still untouched. "Keep moving," the voice said. "Don't spend time on what's already gone." On paper, this cabin was already gone. The roofline sagged on one side. Flames licked under the eaves. Every training manual he'd ever read would have backed him up if he'd waved the driver on. But nothing in those manuals had mentioned a bobcat like this. Solace stood on the porch as if the boards belonged to her. The headlights caught the dust on her whiskers, the smoke-darkened fur along her flanks. Any other night, any other fire, a bobcat would have been a blur, gone before the siren ever rounded the corner. These animals survive by staying unseen, by slipping away. She did not slip away. As Calvin pushed open the cab door, the heat rushed in, thick and immediate. Boots hit gravel. He heard one of the crew call after him. "Cap, command said, I heard them," he answered, already moving. "I'm just taking a look." On the porch, Solace shifted exactly once. She gave him a slice of space near the door, nothing more. Her body was still angled partly across it, as if she were reluctant to leave that spot entirely. Up close, he could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, each inhale edged with smoke. There's a simple human fear that comes with facing any wildcat, even a small one. Calvin felt it flicker in his chest, a tug that said, "You don't belong this close." But there was another tug too, stronger. Ash swirling in the beam of his flashlight. A glimpse of that narrow wooden bed through the side window, the knowledge that the fire wasn't at full roar inside. Not yet. He reached for the doorknob. The metal was hot, but not searing. A good sign if you're looking for one. The door stuck at first, swollen from the heat and the spray of earlier effort somewhere up the road. He threw a shoulder into it. It gave with a groan. Smoke met him like a wall. Inside, the air was thick and brown, the kind that scours your throat on the first breath. He dropped low, the way years of drills had taught him, one hand on the wall, sweeping the beam of his light across the floor. Main room first. A couch, a table, a chair pushed half back as if someone had stood up in a hurry. No bodies, no voices. He could have turned around right there. From the porch, someone shouted something about roof integrity. Time. Always time. A minute here could mean losing a whole other house down the road. Calvin's lungs burned. He coughed, squinted, and told himself to be smart. And then, through the haze, he saw it again. The outline he'd noticed from the truck. A low wooden frame against the back wall of a smaller side room. Crib-sized, narrow. The kind of bed that looks almost out of place when you're used to standard mattresses and metal rails. He moved toward it. In the beam of his flashlight, the details sharpened. The bed was simple, handmade maybe, its edges rounded by years of use. The blanket on top was scorched at the corners, a pattern of black licking in from the sides. And on Calvin saw a face gray with soot, lips edged with blue, lashes clumped from sweat and smoke. For one long stretched-out beat, there was no sound but his own breathing and the ticking of the fire eating into the frame above them. Then training slammed back into place. "Victim found!" he shouted, voice hoarse. "Adult male, back room, still breathing." It was a close thing. Daniel's chest rose and fell so shallowly that if Calvin hadn't been looking right at it, he might have missed it. There was no time for gentleness. He slid an arm under Daniel's shoulders, another under his knees, lifting him from the bed. The body in his arms was heavy and slack, smelling of smoke and sweat, and the faint, almost sweet smell of singed fabric. He carried him through the hallway, past photos he barely registered on the walls, past shelves with little everyday things that would never matter more than they did in that second. As he stepped back onto the porch, the world roared back in. Voices, the engine's rumble, the rush of air. Solace was no longer standing directly at the door. She had moved to the side just enough to let him pass with his burden. Calvin didn't have room in his head to marvel at that, but the image would come back to him later. The bobcat, the burning cabin, the man in his arms. Outside, the crew took over like the well-practiced team they were. Oxygen mask, quick assessment, radio call to the medic unit, staged down the road. Someone guided Calvin away from the doorway, in case the roof chose that moment to give. He stood there for a second, hands empty, watching them work on a stranger whose life he'd almost driven past. People would later argue about what had really saved Daniel. Some would say it was Calvin's instinct, honed by years on the line. Others would point to the training, the protocols, the way the crew moved like a single organism once the call went out.
A few would shake their heads and say it was the bobcat.
Plain and simple, that no firefighter in his right mind stops for a half-lost cabin unless something truly strange holds his attention. Wildlife folks weighed in with their own angle. Bobcats, they reminded everyone, usually want nothing to do with human structures during a fire. Their safest move is to vanish into drawers and rocky pockets, not stand their ground on a wooden porch. Solace's behavior was unusual, yes, remarkable, but whether it was grief, instinct, confusion, or some tangled knot of all three, no one could say for certain. And maybe that uncertainty is part of what made the story spread. In a world that likes neat answers, here was a moment that refused to be pinned down. A man lived. A bobcat stayed. A firefighter listened to a quiet nudge that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. If you've ever looked back at a choice and thought, I almost went the other way, this is a place where our lives brush up against Calvin's. Most of us won't face a burning house, but we all have our porches, those thin thresholds where we either step in or keep driving. In the next part, we'll leave the smoke and sirens for a while and step into a different kind of aftermath. The quiet house on the edge of town where Frank and May Dalton, long retired from the front lines, will be asked to open a door they thought they'd closed forever. If this part of the story has stirred something in you, take a breath and stay with us. What happens after the rescue? The slow, everyday work of healing and saying yes again may be where the biggest changes really take root. Some doors you close because you have to. Others you close because you're sure your heart can't take opening them again. On the quiet side of town, away from the sirens and the worst of the smoke, Frank and May Dalton lived in a single-story house with a view of the pines. It was the kind of place older couples grow into. A front porch with 2 chairs, a wind chime that had seen more seasons than some of the neighbors, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee and something simmering on the back burner. Down the hallway, the last door on the left stayed mostly shut. Once, that room had belonged to their daughter. Years ago, a different house, a different fire. A middle-of-the-night call that pulled Frank out of bed and put him behind the wheel of an engine heading toward his own address. The details of that night didn't get told around the dinner table. They lived instead in the way May's hand lingered on photo frames, in the way Frank checked smoke alarms twice as often as the pamphlet said. When they moved to this smaller place on the edge of the woods, they unpacked just enough for the 2 of them. The boxes marked with their daughter's name went into the garage, stacked carefully, labels facing out. The spare bedroom became a half-finished kind of space. A bed made up with neutral sheets, a dresser with only a few drawers filled, curtains that stayed mostly drawn. Ready for guests, they told people, but they rarely invited anyone to stay long enough to need it. They had their rituals. May baked extra and sent casseroles down to the station on long shift days, even after Frank retired. Frank kept a small radio in the den tuned to the fire channels, listening more than he'd admit, leaning closer when the word wildfire came across. On hot, dry evenings, he would carry a bucket of water out to the fence line and set it under the shade of a juniper for the deer and coyotes and the occasional bobcat that skirted the edge of their property. It was a way of staying connected without letting the past swallow them whole. The night of Daniel's rescue, news spread through town faster than official updates could keep up. A cabin saved. A man was pulled from a smoke-filled room, a bobcat that refused to give up the porch. Folks repeated the story in grocery aisles and gas stations, each retelling adding a little color, a little awe. The next morning, the phone rang in the Dalton kitchen. It wasn't the station calling for help on a blaze. It was the hospital social worker, a woman with a tired voice and a list of problems to solve. They had a patient from the fire, she said. Adult male, smoke inhalation, burns, disorientation. His mother was safe but overwhelmed. Her own housing was uncertain now that their cabin was gone. The hospital could keep him for a while, but not forever. He would need a stable place to heal, people who understood the long tale of fire.
"We thought of you,"
the social worker said gently.
"Frank with your background, May with yours. Just for a little while, just until they get their feet under them."
It sounded at first like a small request. A few weeks, a spare room is finally being used for something good. But Frank and May looked at each other across the kitchen table, and they both knew it meant more than that. Letting someone into your home is one thing. Letting them into the places you've kept wrapped in quiet is another. They didn't answer right away. They talked instead about practicalities, medication schedules, follow-up appointments, oxygen needs, and the logistics of getting to town. May asked detailed questions, and the old nurse in her stepping forward. Frank stared at the closed hallway door, seeing not the blank paint, but all the nights it had guarded. In the end, it wasn't a grand, cinematic decision. It was a series of small ones. May placing a second mug on the counter, unprompted. Frank going out to the garage and standing in front of the boxes with their daughter's name on them, laying a hand on the top one and whispering something no one else heard. They moved a few things. They opened the curtains in the spare room all the way. They turned down the bed. When Daniel arrived from the hospital, still weak, still carrying the wildfire in his lungs, the house noticed. The floorboards gathered new footsteps. The hallway, so used to two voices, learned the rhythm of a third. At night, when he woke coughing or disoriented, May would sit on the edge of that spare bed and count his breaths with him until they slowed. Frank would stand in the doorway sometimes, one hand on the frame, watching the way Daniel's chest rose and fell, eyes caught between the present and a night years ago when it had not. They didn't call it healing. They called it getting by and taking it a day at a time. But the small things added up. The extra place set at the table without discussion. The way May began to buy his favorite cereal without asking. The way Frank found himself explaining the scanner traffic to him, pointing out which codes meant they've got it and which meant this one's bad. There was tension, too. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, or the evening news showed a line of flame in some other state, the house tightened. Grief doesn't vanish just because a second chance walks through your door. It learns to sit alongside it. For many in their age group, this will feel familiar. The way life sometimes offers another opportunity long after you've decided you're done risking that part of yourself. A grandchild showing up when you'd stopped imagining kids in the yard. A rescue dog curling up on the couch after you'd said, "Never again." A neighbor knocking for help on a day you'd planned to be alone. In the Daltons' house, the wild and the human brushed against each other quietly. Daniel stood at the back fence one evening, still on the mend, and watched a bobcat slip along the tree line. Just a shadow at first, and then a clear, steady shape in the dusk. He didn't know her story yet, or that theirs were already tied together. He just watched, hand on the fence post, feeling something like recognition. In the next part of this story, we'll follow that shadow up the hill, to the Wildlife Rescue Center, where Solace was taken after the fire, and to the people who have made it their life's work to care for animals like her, without taming what makes them wild. If the Daltons' quiet yes has stirred a memory of your own, a time you opened a door you thought would stay shut, stay with us. The way these human and bobcat paths keep crossing has more to say about second chances than any speech ever could. Before the story spread through town, before anyone called her a hero, Solace woke up under fluorescent lights. The last thing she'd known was heat and noise, sirens, voices, the slam of a door as Calvin carried Daniel past her on the porch. Somewhere in that chaos, animal control had arrived. A dart, a sting, the world tilting. Then nothing. When she opened her eyes again, the sky was gone. In its place, a metal roof, the hum of a fan,
the soft murmur of humans using their inside voices.
The air smelled like disinfectant, dry straw, and other animals. Not the open hills, she knew, but not the burning woods either. Something in between. They had brought her to a small wildlife rescue center on the edge of town.
You've probably driven past places like it without noticing. Low buildings, tucked behind shelter belts, a faded sign with a paw print, a gravel lot with 3 trucks and an old van. No ticket booth, no gift shop. Just a handful of people doing quiet work for creatures who didn't ask to be here. A vet leaned over the crate where Solace lay and listened to her lungs with a stethoscope. Short, strained breaths. The telltale rattle of smoke inhalation. A tech checked her paws for burns, gently turning each one in gloved hands, watching for flinches.
Another person recorded numbers on a clipboard, heart rate, respiration, and weight. To Solace, it was all intrusion. Needles, tubes, strange hands.
Her body told her to fight, to claw, to run. The sedation kept that impulse under a heavy blanket. But in the tight set of her jaw, in the way her eyes tracked every movement, you could see the wild animal still very much present. The staff understood. They didn't coo over her. They spoke in low, even tones, more for each other than for her. Adult female bobcat, likely from the ridge herd. Some singeing on the fur, mild burns.
Moderate smoke exposure. She's lucky it wasn't worse.
Lucky, one of them said, then caught herself and softened it.
As lucky as you can be when your home burns down.
Later, over a thermos of coffee in the tiny break room, they heard what the rest of town was saying.
A firefighter came by to drop off paperwork, and like everyone else that week, needed to talk.
She was on the porch, he said, shaking his head slowly. Right on the boards. Didn't run when we pulled up. If she'd bolted like normal, we might have pushed right past that cabin.
He looked over through the window at the enclosure where Solace now rested.
I know you folks keep things scientific around here. I'm not saying she knew.
I'm just saying,
that cat stood her ground. The rehab director nodded. They'd heard 3 different versions of the story already.
In one, Solace had practically led the crew to the door.
In another, she had waited at the threshold until Daniel was carried out.
The details grew with each retelling, the way stories do when people need them.
At the center, they tried to hold 2 truths at once.
1.
Bobcats are wild animals with instincts and stress patterns and ecological roles that have nothing to do with human ideas about heroes. 2. What happened on that porch was not ordinary. It would have been easy to lean into the miracle,
to post a photo, to give her a cute nickname, to let the rescue center become the place where the hero bobcat lives. Donations would roll in, tours would follow.
Instead, they drew a line. No public viewing, no posters. When local reporters called asking for footage, the director chose her words carefully.
We're caring for a bobcat affected by the fire, she said. Our goal is to return her safely to her habitat when she's ready.
The best way to honor what happened is to give her back her freedom.
Gratitude, they believed, didn't mean ownership. It meant support.
It meant gas in the rehab van, fresh straw in the enclosures, x-rays and medicine, paid for by checks that came in quiet envelopes.
And those envelopes did come. A ranch family dropped off a stack of old towels and a jar of bills from a bake sale their neighbors had thrown together.
The church that had opened its doors as a shelter added Wildlife Center to the list on its donation basket.
A retired teacher brought in a shoebox of art supplies and asked if the local kids, grown now,
but still her students in her heart,
could paint bobcat habitat scenes for the lobby, just to remind people who they were doing this for.
The people who never make the news stepped forward in dozens of small ways.
Someone mowed the grass along the fence. Someone else patched a hole in the roof.
A local mechanic refused to charge for work on the center's van.
These helpers didn't stand on a porch and face down a wildfire, but their choices carried a different kind of courage. The willingness to show up again and again
without applause.
Back in her enclosure, Solace healed in fits and starts. Her breathing eased. The singed fur along her sides would eventually shed out and regrow. The staff watched for signs of deeper harm, confusion, repetitive pacing, lack of interest in food.
She paced, yes, but not in the tight circles of an animal broken by captivity.
Her path traced the perimeter, nose to the chain link, eyes always turned toward the distant tree line. They adjusted her care accordingly. Less time near the building, more in the back enclosures, where the wind carried pine and dust instead of bleach. No unnecessary handling, no talking to her like a pet.
They wanted her to remember exactly who she was. A bobcat from the Arizona high country, belonging to that larger, scarred landscape that stretched beyond the town. When she was finally strong enough, they loaded her into a crate one last time and drove up a rough track to a ridge that looked down over the valley.
The fire scars were still visible, blackened trunks, patches of raw, exposed earth. But here and there, green pushed through. Grasses, saplings, life insisting. They opened the crate. For a long moment, Solace didn't move. Then she stepped out, slowly, testing the ground. The wind brought her the familiar cocktail of scents: dirt, rock, faint smoke, the musk of distant deer. Below, the town lay quiet, roofs catching the light. She looked in that direction once. It might mean nothing. It might mean everything. The rehab team didn't narrate it. They just watched as she slipped between the rocks and vanished back into the country that had shaped her. If you've ever wondered what happens to the wild animals after the headlines fade, this is part of the answer. They go to places like this, into the hands of people you'll likely never meet. And then, if all goes well, they go home, and the rest of us are left with a choice. What to do with the gratitude we feel for a story like Solace's. In the next part, we'll step forward in time and see how that one night of fire changed the way Daniel, Isabel, and the Daltons live with smoke seasons and second chances, year after year. If you can, stay with this story. And when you hear about a rehab center or a small rescue in your own area, maybe let this bobcat's quiet journey come to mind. Sometimes the most powerful help never makes it onto the porch. It works behind the scenes, keeping the wildness in the world alive. There are nights when the fire is long gone, but the sound of a siren can still make your heart forget what year it is. The first summer after the wildfire, the valley looked like a patchwork quilt someone had mended in a hurry. From a distance, you could see it clearly. Strips of black where the flames had run hard, patches of untouched green where the wind had shifted just in time, swaths of soft new growth pushing through ash. Up close it was messier, charred stumps beside blooming wildflowers, half-melted fence posts next to rebuilt porches. Life does come back. It just doesn't come back to the same place it left. For Isabel, living after the fire meant learning a new map of safety. Sirens were no longer background noise. Red flag warnings on the weather report were enough to make her fingers tighten around whatever she was holding. A dish towel, a steering wheel, the edge of a grocery cart. Each summer, when the first plume of smoke rose from some far-off ridge, even if it was a small, managed burn, part of her was back at that roadblock again, arguing with a deputy who didn't want her to die trying to save her own. She didn't talk about this much. Instead, she folded her fear into routine. Go bags by the front door. Important papers in one drawer, always ready. Gas tank, never below half. She learned the difference between the thin ribbon of smoke from a neighbor's grill and the thick, unsettled column that meant trouble in the timber. She listened to people who'd grown up here, who could read the color of the sky like a forecast. Daniel carried the fire in his body for a while. Lungs prone to coughing fits, scars mapping his skin in places only he and his doctors saw. But it also settled into his days in quieter ways. He became the one who checked the batteries in the Daltons' smoke alarms without being asked. The one who made sure the yard stayed raked and the gutters cleared. Not out of paranoia, but out of a kind of wary respect. He joined a local volunteer crew that worked on fuel breaks and habitat restoration in the off-season. Weekends found him on hillsides with a shovel, planting small pines and native grasses in lines carefully calculated by people who knew how fire behaved. The work was slow, almost boring at times. Hole, seedling, soil, repeat. But there was a steadiness to it that felt right. Fire had changed him in an instant. Tending the land changed him by degrees.
Sometimes on those workdays, he'd find bobcat tracks pressed into the ash near a tree line. Wide paws, distinct pads, the whisper of wildlife still moving through what had burned. He'd pause for a second, tracing the arc of the prints with his eyes, imagining Solace up there somewhere. Older now, maybe with new litters, moving in her own pattern of smoke and green. At home, the Daltons adjusted to the new shape of their household. The spare room was no longer a half-closed space. It was Daniel's room now, officially and without apology. Family photos were expanded on the hallway wall.
There were still days when the past rushed in, birthdays missed, anniversaries of the fire they'd known long before this one. Grief didn't pack its bags and leave.
It pulled up a chair at the same table where new stories were being told. Faith, for them, lived in small gestures.
A hand resting on a shoulder when the scanner crackled to life. A whispered thanks over a meal on days when the air outside stayed clear. Lighting a candle, not just for the ones they'd lost, but for the crews still out there. The animals still learning the edges of the new landscape. The families like Isabel's, who now counted fire seasons as part of their calendar. Not everyone in town saw that night on the porch the same way. Some shrugged and said, "Right place, right time. Lucky break."
Others talked about the bobcat as if she were a sign sent from somewhere they didn't have proper words for.
Most people fell somewhere in between, content to let that mystery stand. What mattered more, over time, was what they did with it. The Wildlife Rehab Center found itself with more volunteers than it had clipboards.
People came wanting to do something that matched the feeling they had when they first heard about the bobcat who wouldn't leave the burning cabin.
Some cleaned cages, some folded linens, some simply sat in the office and helped with paperwork, freeing up staff to be where they were needed most. Gratitude had turned into action. Quiet, but real. The town council started taking forest management meetings more seriously.
Conversations about defensible space shifted from abstract lectures to shared responsibility.
Not every idea was popular. Nobody likes being told to cut down trees in their yard. But the memory of that fire season and of who had almost been lost added weight to the choices. For Daniel, living after the fire also meant learning how to be in his own skin again when the world felt safe.
You don't go through something like that and walk away untouched.
There were nights when he woke up with smoke in his throat that wasn't really there. Mornings when the sight of plum-colored clouds at sunrise looked too much like the sky over the cabin that night. Talking helped. So did sitting in silence on the porch with Frank, both men watching the tree line without needing to fill it with words.
If any of this resonates with you, if you've had your own seasons where everything familiar suddenly felt fragile, you're in good company here.
The older we get, the more we understand that surviving isn't just about making it through the worst day. It's about what we choose to plant in the soil of all the days after. And so, year by year, smoke season followed green season, and green season followed smoke. The land healed in fits and starts. The people did too. Somewhere up on the ridges, a bobcat moved along old paths and new ones, carrying her own history of flame and recovery in every cautious step. In our last part, we'll sit on a porch at dusk with these lives that have been changed by one night. A firefighter, a mother, a couple who opened their home, a man who once lay on a narrow bed in a burning room, and we'll see what has quietly taken root in them since. If you can, stay with this story just a little longer. Sometimes it's in these late evening moments, when the worst is behind but not forgotten, that the deepest kind of hope finally makes itself known. Even long after a wildfire is out, there are evenings when the light on the hills looks a little like flame. On one of those evenings, years after the night of the burning cabin, the porch behind the Daltons' house sits in that soft in-between day not quite gone, night not quite here. The pines on the ridge are a darker stripe against the sky. Some bear the black scars of old fire. Some are young, fresh green, pushing up where ash once lay. 2 chairs, 1 small table, nothing fancy. Daniel sits in one, a glass of water sweating beside him. The world around him is quiet, in the way only small towns can be at dusk. A dog barking once, and then giving up.
A truck shifting gears on the distant highway, the low hum of crickets starting up in the grass. This is where the story that began with sirens and a bobcat on a burning porch has settled into a life that looks ordinary until you know what it's come through. On the wall, just inside the door, there's a sketch in a simple frame. If you look closely, it's a scene you already know. A cabin, a narrow wooden bed drawn in a back window, and on the porch, the outline of a bobcat standing in front of the door. Below it, in small handwriting, just 2 words: for solace. Nobody stops to explain it when guests come over. It's simply there, like a quiet stone at the edge of a trail. Out here on the porch, the conversation is light tonight. The worst of the trauma years have passed. Isabel talks about the new trees planted up on the ridge, how some of them are already taller than the fence. Frank mentions the latest update from the wildfire crew 2 counties over, and how grateful he is that this season has stayed kinder so far. May brings out a plate of something freshly baked and tells them to eat before the bugs do. They laugh, the way people do when they've earned it. But there are small tells that the fire is never completely gone. When a siren floats up from town, the porch falls silent for a moment. Everyone listens, not with fear exactly, but with attention. Old habits, new wisdom. When a wisp of smoke curls from a neighbor's grill and drifts over the fence, Isabel's hand pauses halfway to her glass. She waits, breath held, until her mind registers the familiar tang of charcoal instead of the dry, bitter scent of timber burning. Then she exhales and smiles just a little at herself. These are the traces that stay. We tend to think of survival as one dramatic moment: the rescue, the narrow escape, the bobcat that refused to leave the burning cabin. But for most people, living after a wildfire means this: checking the sky a little more often every summer, knowing where your important papers are, learning which kind of cough in your chest is just the season changing, and which one means it's time to see a doctor who knows what smoke can do to lungs. It means being the person in your circle who pays attention when the news mentions dry lightning and high winds. It also means, for Daniel, walking different kinds of fire lines now, not with a hose and a helmet, but with a shovel and a sapling, joining crews that plant trees and clear brush and create space where flames, if they come, have less to feed on. It's a quiet kind of work. No headlines, just hands in dirt, backs sore at the end of the day, and the knowledge that somewhere down the line, someone's home might still be standing because of a Saturday you spent sweating on a hillside. Somewhere above those hills, bobcats still move along their old routes, adjusting to new patches of open ground, slipping through the border between wilderness and back fences. Maybe Solace is still among them, older now, her own wild story carried in muscle and memory. Maybe it's her offspring that people see in the dusk, moving like shadows at the edge of ranch lights. We don't have to decide whether what happened on that porch was a miracle, instinct, or some tangled mix of both to let it change how we see the wild animals around us. It can be enough to know that this one bobcat, shaped by her own loss, stood between a cabin and the dark on a night when a man needed every kind of help he could get. As the last light slips off the ridge, Daniel looks toward the tree line. It's mostly a habit now. Some nights he sees nothing but trunks and branches. Some nights he catches the briefest flicker of movement, a shape low to the ground, moving with intention, then gone. He doesn't say much about it. He just feels a little less alone, as if the line between his life and that hillside is thinner than it looks on a map. For many of us, there's a porch like this somewhere in our own story, a place where we sit with what we've been through, where the worst is behind us, but still close enough to touch. Maybe it's a literal deck with a view of trees. Maybe it's a chair by a window, or a favorite spot on a walking trail where you always slow down. If this story has stayed with you, you might take a moment after this video ends to think about your own ridge line. What scars and green shoots live side by side in you now? What small habits have you carried forward from the fires you've known, whatever form they took? And where, at the edges of your days, do the wild things still move, reminding you that the world is bigger than the worst thing that ever happened?
If this journey with Daniel, Isabel, the Daltons, and a bobcat named Solace has touched something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd stay connected with us here. Gently tapping like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this story helps it find others who may need a quiet reminder that survival can be tender,
And the connection with nature and with animals can still heal places we thought were finished. And if you feel moved to go one step further, you're welcome to use Super Thanks or donate in whatever way feels right for you
to support wildlife rescue and rehabilitation in your own area, to help care for and protect wild animals like bobcats, so that when fire comes to their world, there are hands ready to help them find their way back home.